In the battle for world domination, there's no morality. What counts is results.
For decades, this place was the source of conspiracy theories about strange goings-on.
Sterilizations, crude transplants.
We did do something that was not kosher.
The researchers themselves didn't make the sacrifice. They didn't inject themselves. They didn't inject their children. They didn't inject their wives. They didn't do that. They decided to pick these unsuspecting civilian victims.
In war, nations will do pretty much anything to defeat their enemies. And throughout history, there have been some pretty crazy ideas carried out to try to gain an advantage. Here is a list of the wildest and most messed up wartime experiments and inventions ever carried out. Number 10. Animal bombs. Animals have been used in warfare for thousands of years, with cavalry being regularly seen on the battlefield all the way through to the 20th century. Since then, there have been several new experimental weapons that have been utilized by different governments involving animals. If you're an animal lover, you might want to skip this part. One of the more widely known animal weaponization efforts was the Soviet Union anti-tank dogs. Between 1930 and 1946, the Soviet Army taught dogs to carry explosives to tanks, armored vehicles, and other targets. They first used these dogs during Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. Initially, the dogs were trained to leave a timer-detonated bomb under the target vehicle and retreat back to their trainers. However, this was later replaced by the use of impact detonation bombs, which killed the dog in the explosion. The first group of 30 Soviet mine dogs were deployed on the front line in 1941. But their use was almost a complete failure. The dogs would refuse to dive under moving tanks. They would run near the tanks waiting for them to stop, only to be shot before that happened, and some even got scared and ran back to their trainers, killing their own troops instead. Out of those 30 first dogs, only 4 detonated their bombs near German tanks. 6 exploded in their own trenches, accidentally killing their own men. So, dog bombs thankfully never caught on, but other animals have also been considered for the job. Dolphins have also been seen as potentially effective animals for military use. In the early 1990s, a Russian military officer allegedly trained several dolphins to attack enemy ships. It is said he carried out tests showing that dolphins were able to differentiate between allied and enemy ships from the sounds of their propellers. In theory, they could therefore be used to drag explosives to enemy ships. Despite apparently giving up on the project and selling the dolphins to Iran, the Russian military continues to train dolphins for military purposes to this day.
According to state media, the Russian Defense Ministry is looking for 5 bottlenose dolphins for military duty.
Other countries such as the US, Israel, and Ukraine have also reportedly trained dolphins and other marine mammals for military operations.
The US military has also trained dolphins and sea lions to perform tasks like detecting enemy submarines and to patrol the waters around naval bases, protecting against potential terror threats.
During the Second World War, the American military also began developing the bat bomb for use against Japan. The experimental weapon consisted of a bomb-shaped casing with over 1,000 compartments inside. Each compartment contained a hibernating Mexican free-tailed bat with a small timed incendiary bomb attached to it. The idea was that the bomb would deploy a parachute before hitting the ground and release the bats inside. They would then disperse and roost in attics, barns, and anywhere else bats are usually found. The incendiaries would eventually ignite, causing fires to break out across Japanese towns and cities, largely made up of buildings built of wood and paper. Once again, this operation turned out to be a waste of time and money. The US eventually dropped the operation after an accidental fire on a military base in New Mexico, and another more famous World War II bomb project taking priority. Number 9. Pain rays. Now here's one that sounds like it's straight out of a science fiction novel. Originally deployed for use in Afghanistan, the active denial system is a non-lethal directed energy weapon developed by the US military. It works by heating the surface of the target, such as the skin of a potential enemy. These so-called pain rays were deployed in 2010 in Afghanistan, but were withdrawn without ever seeing combat. It was later adopted by law enforcement back home, with the intent of using the weapon on incarcerated people in LA to break up prison fights and crowd control. The weapon works by firing high-powered, high-frequency waves, functioning similarly to a microwave oven. Through a process called dielectric heating, the high-frequency radio waves or microwaves heats the target material. The device is capable of causing extreme pain, as well as inflicting actual damage including second-degree surface burns. The surface temperature of a target will continue to rise as long as the beam is applied. with most human subjects unable to bear the feeling of the beam for more than 3 seconds. The pain is reportedly unbearable. While the sensation is initially comparable to a hairdryer blast on the skin, it becomes agonizing within just a few seconds.
Most described it as feeling like a hot oven or grill being opened up.
It is something that, once again, probably the safest system that we've developed as far as the non-lethal capability.
The U.S. has reportedly spent over $120 million on the weapons development, with rumors of China and Russia also attempting to develop their own similar technologies. Supporters of the ray say it's safe, with serious injuries being much less likely that with the use of tear gas, rubber bullets, and other non-lethal weapons. However, they aren't quite as scary as an invisible pain ray. Number 8. The acoustic kitty. Is it possible to turn a cat into a bug? In the 1960s, the CIA launched one of the most bizarre espionage projects ever, Operation Acoustic Kitty. In an attempt to create a walking, purring, feline spy, the CIA implanted a microphone into a cat's ear canal, a small radio transmitter at the base of its skull, and a thin wire into its fur. In theory, the cat would then be able to record and transmit sound from its surroundings, allowing the CIA to listen in on enemy conversations. The experimental spying software was more or less a total failure, with the CIA dropping the project after allegedly spending $20 million on it. There are several accounts explaining why the project was dropped. Most accounts seem to suggest that it simply wasn't practical. Another account, however, claims that the project was cancelled after its first mission, when the acoustic kitty was tasked with listening into a conversation between 2 men in a park near the Soviet embassy. According to the account, the cat was hit by a taxi almost immediately after being released, bringing an abrupt end to the operation.
And as this poor little monstrosity waddled across the street, a taxi cab came down and ran it over. So it was $25 million down the drain.
Number 7. Stargate. The potential use of supernatural weapons has been investigated by several nations throughout history, with Hitler famously having an interest in the occult and the potential power that might come with it. The US also explored this possibility, however, focusing on the potential use of psychic phenomena in intelligence operations. The project underwent numerous name changes throughout its existence, but was eventually rechristened as the Stargate Project. Its aim was to utilize psychic techniques such as remote viewing, predicting the future, and mind reading to discover enemy secrets.
It was only with the event of the Cold War that we discovered that Russia actually was operating some people who were able to locate information, particularly in the United States. When America found out about it, they thought this actually was quite a good idea.
The project was founded in part due to the news that the Soviet government was investigating the existence of psychic phenomena. In order to prevent falling behind on a potentially Cold War winning technology, the US followed suit. For over 20 years, the project attempted to harness the use of psychic powers, but all information provided by the program was vague, irrelevant, and erroneous. The project was made up of only 15 to 20 individuals and ran from an old wooden barracks. Stargate was terminated in 1995 after the CIA decided that it was never of any use to US intelligence operations. Number 6. The Porton Down Human Trials. From 1949 to 1989, the British military carried out chemical weapons experiments on its own soldiers, both on the facility itself in the west of England and in Britain's territories overseas. Scientists from Porton Down tested deadly weapons on thousands of its own troops.
Porton Down is one of the most secretive military establishments in the UK. It is the location of the Defence Science and Technology Laboratories, hidden away on Salisbury Plain.
The Rawalpindi experiments were one of the worst documented examples of this practice, when soldiers from the British Indian Army stationed in Pakistan were tested on by scientists from the infamous facility. The experiments began in the 1930s and continued for over a decade, during which 20,000 Indian soldiers were subjected to these inhumane tests. Test subjects were placed into gas chambers, wearing shorts and cotton shirts. Mustard gas was then pumped into the chambers, while scientists noted its effects. The idea was to determine the appropriate dosage to use in combat, with many soldiers suffering severe burns. More tests carried out by the scientists at Porton Down included nerve agent testing in the 1940s and 50s. In an attempt to build their understanding of nerve agents and how to defend against them, scientists carried out tests on servicemen. Numerous reports of unethical treatments and experimentation on soldiers have been reported from the facility, with the death of Ronald Madison from sarin poisoning in 1953 causing a massive investigation to be carried out.
The experiments are conducted on military volunteers, but the young servicemen have no idea what they are letting themselves in for.
The potential effects of using LSD as a combat inhibitor were also carried out, in which British soldiers were given the drug without their consent and made to carry out field exercises. Despite eventually paying millions in compensation to the victims of these tests, the Ministry of Defense has refused to apologize for its actions. Number 5. War elephants and flaming pigs. We couldn't make this video without including some of the ancient experimental weapons of the past as well. Firstly, if you thought facing down a charging cavalry unit would be scary, imagine how you'd feel if it was elephants charging at you instead. War elephants were the tanks of the ancient world, capable of smashing through enemy shield formations and inspiring fear in hostile armies. With their immense strength and tough hides, elephants were used by several ancient powers on the battlefield, with mixed success.
They're big, they're grey, they make strange noises, they're smelly, they frighten.
In 331 BC, Alexander the Great was so nervous about the Persian army's elephants that he made a sacrifice to the god of fear before the battle began. The most famous use of the beasts was by the Carthaginian general Hannibal in 218 BC, when he marched his army of elephants over the Alps to face the Roman legions.
These were the Carthaginians' terror weapon. Small numbers of elephants could have a massive effect.
But innovation breeds innovation, and some ancient commanders soon discovered that releasing flaming pigs onto the battlefield was very effective in scaring the attacking elephants, causing them to turn and trample on their own soldiers. The pigs were covered in flammable oil or pitch before being set alight and released onto the battlefield. Since the lifespan of a flaming pig is short, however, the range of these experimental pigs was limited. Pigs would also sometimes turn towards their own troops in a panic, causing fires and terror to break out on the user's side as well as the enemy's. Number 4. Iceberg boats. The Second World War led to the invention of many forms of new technology that changed the way in which wars were fought forever. Geoffrey Pike's idea of building ships out of icebergs was not one of them. During the war, aircraft carriers were in short supply, but were pivotal in achieving the air superiority needed to win the war. Steel and aluminium were the key materials needed to build the giant ships, but both were in short supply as well. The military were considering ways in which you could cut down the amount of steel and aluminium you need to build an aircraft carrier, when Pike revealed his radical new idea of building ships out of ice. The British government jumped on the idea, and soon, construction began. Pike's design used pikerite, a mixture of 68% water and 14% wood pulp that is effectively a reinforced kind of ice. However, soon after beginning construction, it became clear that there was a major problem with the design. A 1,000-ton model that was being built in Canada began to melt. The ship had to be kept under 3 degrees Fahrenheit at all times, something that proved difficult. The designers tried to solve these issues by refrigerating the boat while constructing it, an idea that ended up using thousands of tons of steel itself. After a year of failed attempts, the Royal Navy gave up on the idea. The prototype was allowed to sink to the bottom of the ocean and soon melted away into history. Number 3. Nazi war experiments. The Japanese weren't the only ones who carried out human experiments during the Second World War, with the Nazis famously conducting horrific medical experiments on prisoners within their concentration camps. Between 1942 and 1945, over 15,000 victims from various nationalities and groups were experimented on by the Nazis, with many believing the true figure is much higher. At Auschwitz and other death camps, selected inmates were subjected to a wide range of experiments, usually focusing on weapons testing, medical science, and eugenics. These tests were designed not only to judge the effectiveness of weapons and treatments, but also to further the Nazis' ideas surrounding eugenics and the Germanic master race. Some of the most shocking experiments carried out were the blood coagulation experiments, where patients were given blood-clotting medication before being shot, or having their limbs amputated without anesthesia. Other tests included the transplant experiments, where subjects had their bones, muscles, and nerves removed without anesthesia. Mass sterilization experiments where subjects were sterilized with X-rays and experimental medication. Deliberate infections were caused. Homosexuals were experimented on to see if they could be turned heterosexual, and numerous others.
I had hallucination I got a very high fever.
Some of the most infamous experiments were the twin experiments of Joseph Mengele, known by his pseudonym, the Angel of Death. Mengele attempted to prove that the Germanic DNA was superior to others and wanted to help the German people produce more twins to increase population. His twin experiments included amputating healthy limbs, deliberately infecting pairs of twins with deadly diseases, and even sewing them together to artificially create conjoined twins. Most of the victims died during these experiments, with only about 200 surviving out of 1,500 test subjects.
Once I tried to come here with my children and I couldn't move. I was paralyzed.
Number 2, nuke tests. As you probably know, the Americans were the first to create the atomic bomb in 1945. The weapon of mass destruction helped the Allies win the Second World War. But since then, many different kinds of nukes have been experimented with. In total, over 2,000 nuclear bombs have been detonated so far around the world, but not all of them have just been regular atomic bombs like the ones dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 7 years after the first atom bomb was tested, the US government tested the first thermonuclear bomb, also called a hydrogen bomb. Given the name Ivy Mike, the first thermonuclear bomb was detonated near the Marshall Islands in 1952. It was 500 times more powerful than the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Since then, several more advancements have been made that massively increase the power of thermonuclear weapons. The most powerful ever detonated was called the Tsar Bomba, developed by the Soviet Union in 1961. The total power of detonation was around 2,500 times greater than that of the original bombs dropped on Japan. But size isn't everything, and other less well-known nuclear weapon experiments have taken place as well. In the 1960s, the Americans began testing guns capable of firing miniature nuclear bombs, with a range of only 2.5 miles. In 1962, the US Army carried out the Little Feller nuclear test, firing the smallest nuclear bomb they ever made into the Nevada desert. The bomb flew just 1.7 miles away from its launch point before exploding with a force equivalent to 18 tons of TNT, 2.5 million times smaller than that of the Tsar Bomba. Different governments around the world weren't just interested in the size of the explosions, they also wanted to find out what effects they would have on human beings. 400,000 American soldiers and sailors observed nuclear blasts from 1946 to 1992, during which they were exposed to dangerous amounts of radiation. But they weren't the only ones. The British government also used their own troops as guinea pigs when testing out nuclear weapons.
To say it was frightening is an understatement. I think it shocked us all into silence. When the flash hit you, you could see the X-rays of your hands through your closed eyes.
These dangerous and inhumane tests have been linked to cancer development in later life, with many test veterans now launching legal action against the government. Number 1. Unit 731. One of the most horrific examples of military experimentation in history, Japan's Unit 731 is considered by some to be the nation's greatest atrocity during the Second World War. The unit was a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development facility located in what is today northern China. During Japan's war with China and the Second World War that it developed into, the Japanese military routinely carried out human experimentation upon Chinese civilians in Unit 731. The captives inside were dehumanized, being referred to as logs, before suffering unimaginable torture and violence at the hands of their captors. Experiments carried out upon adults and children alike included disease injections, hypobaric pressure chamber testing, vivisection, organ harvesting, dehydration experiments, and more.
They infected entire villages with plague in preparation for an attack on the United States.
Although the victims were predominantly Chinese, there was also a significant minority of Russian prisoners. Some test subjects were also babies born from the systematic rape carried out by unit staff. New weapons were used on civilians to test their effectiveness. This wasn't limited to just guns, with grenades, flamethrowers, bayonets, pathogen bombs, and many more being used on victims.
苦しい声を上げてました。だから死んだ理由といえば、悶絶 悶絶苦しんで悶絶死ですね。
Some of these tests have since been deemed to be psychopathically sadistic, with no form of useful military application. One such experiment documented at the time was to see how long it took 3-day-old babies to freeze to death. The facility murdered an estimated 200 to 300,000 people during its existence. As the war came to an end, the Japanese sabotaged the facility and killed all of the remaining prisoners to conceal evidence. Thankfully, they failed to hide all evidence of their crimes, but barely anyone involved with Unit 731 was ever prosecuted after the war. We hope you enjoyed our countdown of the most shocking inventions and experiments ever carried out in war. Do you agree with our list? Which do you think is the most shocking? Let us know in the comments and be sure to subscribe for more.